The ground didn't just make a sound. It screamed. A high, hollow shriek of metal on wood that echoed across the flat, dead earth of Gideon Flint's ranch. For 3 days he'd been digging in this spot, this one patch of land where nothing ever grew. Not a weed, not a blade of grass. His father had called it the Devil's Acre, and Gideon was starting to understand why. He was 8 feet down, sweat stinging his eyes, trying to dig a new well because the creek was running low. He expected rock. He expected clay. He never expected the clean, sharp crack of his shovel biting into finished lumber. He froze, muscles coiled tight, listening to the silence that followed. The wind itself seemed to be holding its breath. Wiping the grime from his brow, he looked down, and his blood ran cold. It was a step, a perfectly carved wooden step, peeking out from the dark soil like a buried tooth. As he scraped away more dirt, another appeared below it, and another. Stairs, descending into a darkness so complete it felt like it was swallowing the light. Gideon had owned this land for 12 years, his father for 30 before that. In all that time, in all the stories the old man told, not once had he mentioned a staircase buried in the barren field. It was impossible. This was his land. He knew every rock, every dip, every dry patch of dirt. He knew it better than he knew his own face in the mirror. But he didn't know this, and that's when he heard it. A whisper, faint at first, like a ghost on the wind. But there was no wind. He dropped the shovel, his knuckles white. The sound was coming from the hole, from the impossible stairs. It wasn't one voice. It was many, tangled together. A woman, her voice tight with fear. A man, low and angry. They were speaking words he couldn't make out, but the feeling behind them was clear as day. Terror. Pain. He dropped to his knees, pressing his ear to the opening, the damp earth cold against his cheek. The voices grew louder, clearer. Someone was crying, a child, and someone else was arguing, their words sharp and cruel. These weren't echoes. These weren't neighbors. These voices were coming from directly beneath his feet, from a place that had no right to exist. And as he listened, a memory hit him like a physical blow. Wagon tracks. For 6 months, he'd seen them now and then at the edge of his property. Fresh ruts in the grass at dawn, gone by noon, too wide for his own cart. He'd written it off as rustlers, cowards cutting across his land in the dead of night. He'd been wrong, so terribly wrong. The woman's voice suddenly rose in a scream, a raw, desperate sound that was cut off with a sickening finality. In the dead silence that followed, a new sound echoed up from the dark. The scrape of heavy metal, the groan of a gate being dragged shut, a lock clicking into place. Gideon scrambled back from the edge, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. This was no forgotten root cellar. This was no storm shelter. The stairs were too new, the voices too real. Someone had built a prison under his land, a prison that was still very much in use. He stood brushing the dirt from his knees, his mind racing. He had to ride for Bleakwood, 20 miles south. Get Sheriff Morrison. Get help. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as he turned to run, one last voice drifted up from the hole. It was the woman. Her voice was weak, broken, but the words were crystal clear, and they would haunt him forever. Please, she begged to the empty darkness. Someone help us. We've been down here for weeks. Weeks. The word burned a hole in Gideon's mind. These people had been suffering, trapped in the dark beneath his boots, while he'd been mending fences and feeding cattle, completely oblivious. Weeks. He should run. He should ride for the sheriff. But he knew Morrison. The man was slow, methodical, and more concerned with the affairs of the wealthy cattle barons than the troubles of a small-time rancher like Gideon. By the time Gideon rode to Bleakwood, convinced the sheriff this wasn't some drunken fantasy, and gathered a posse, 2 days could pass. Maybe more. And the woman's voice, it sounded like she didn't have 2 days. He circled the hole again, his eyes drawn to the stairs. They were oak, solid. The nails were iron, black and new, with no sign of rust. This wasn't old. This was recent, built within the last year, maybe even the last few months. This was a professional job. purposeful. He knelt down again, his fear giving way to a cold, hard resolve. He had to know more. "Hello?" he called down, his voice raspy. "Can you hear me?" For a long moment, there was only silence. He thought maybe they hadn't heard. Maybe they thought it was a trick. Then a faint sound. Footsteps, quick and light. A woman's face appeared in the gloom at the bottom of the stairs. Even in the dim light, he could see the hope and terror warring in her eyes. "Thank God," she breathed, her voice trembling. "Someone found us. Please, you have to help. There are 6 of us. We don't have much time." Gideon's mind was a whirlwind. "Who are you? How did you get down there?" The story spilled out of her in a frantic whisper. Her name was Mercy Whitmore. They were from a wagon train heading west. They were ambushed, dragged here in the dead of night. They said they were keeping us until our families paid," she choked out, a sob catching in her throat. Kidnappers. Not just common bandits. Organized criminals who had built a secret dungeon on his property, choosing this remote, forgotten piece of land because no one would ever think to look here. The wagon tracks he'd seen weren't rustlers. They were deliveries of human cargo. "How many men?" Gideon asked, his voice low and urgent. "When are they coming back?" "3 of them," she said, her words coming faster now. "They bring water and bread every few days. They were here yesterday morning, so they might not be back for—" She stopped, her head tilted, listening. And then Gideon heard it too. A faint drumming sound from the east. Hoofbeats, getting closer. Fast. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was alone. His rifle was 200 yards away, hanging over the fireplace in his cabin, and he was standing over the gaping hole that held the kidnappers' entire operation. There was no time. The riders would be here in minutes. "Get back!" he hissed down the hole. "Hide! Don't make a sound!" He grabbed his shovel and started throwing dirt back over the stairs, a frantic, useless gesture. There was too much earth, too little time. The riders would see the disturbed ground. They would see the half-buried entrance. They would know, and they would kill him without a second thought to protect their secret. 3 riders crested the hill to the east, their figures black against the rising sun. They rode with a purpose that made Gideon's stomach clench. These weren't lost travelers. They knew exactly where they were going. He abandoned the hopeless task of hiding the hole and bolted for a cluster of large boulders 30 yards away, diving behind the biggest one just as the riders crossed his fence line. From his hiding spot, he could see everything. The man in the lead was tall and wore a black hat pulled low. He swung off his horse near the hole and let out a string of curses that turned the air blue. The other 2, younger men, stayed on their horses, their eyes scanning the property. "Someone's been digging here, Boone," one of them called out, his voice sharp in the morning quiet. "Fresh marks. Looks like it was this morning." Boone. The name sent a jolt through Gideon. Boone Carter. A ghost story whispered in saloons across the territory. A name attached to missing travelers, vanished families, and ransoms demanded from relatives 1,000 miles away. Most people thought he was a myth, but the man standing by that hole, radiating pure menace, was no myth. "Check the cabin," Boone snarled. "Find whoever owns this patch of dirt, and be quiet about it. No witnesses." The 2 younger men spurred their horses toward Gideon's small home. Boone knelt by the opening, his movements calm and deliberate. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "Everything all right down there?" he called, his voice deceptively pleasant. "Anyone been by?" There was a pause. Gideon held his breath. Then Mercy's voice floated up, strained but steady. "No one. We heard some digging this morning, but we didn't see anyone." She was lying to protect a man she'd never even seen. The bravery of it staggered him, but it also meant she and the others were now his accomplices. If they were discovered, Boone would show them no mercy. Boone stood, walking a slow circle around the hole, his eyes missing nothing. He was a professional, a predator. "Whoever was here left in a hurry," he called to his men. "Shovels right here. They either saw us coming or something spooked them." A loud crack echoed from the cabin as his men kicked in the door. They'd be inside for a few minutes, then they'd come back out, and the real search would begin. They would comb every inch of this land. They would find him, and they would make him talk before they killed him. Run. The instinct screamed at him. Run for the trees 2 miles west. But leaving meant signing the death warrants for Mercy and 5 others. The two men emerged from the cabin, shaking their heads. Nobody home, Boone. Place is empty, but the stove's still warm. He was here. Boone Carter didn't answer. He pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt and began cleaning his fingernails with the tip. The casual, deadly gesture was more terrifying than any threat. Spread out, he said, his voice soft but caring. Check the barn, the outbuildings, every rock. Our friend is close, probably watching us right now. His eyes, cold and dark as a snake's, swept across the landscape and settled directly on the boulders where Gideon was hiding. And when we find him, Boone continued, a slow smile spreading across his face, we're going to have a long talk. The two men dismounted, splitting up to begin their methodical search. One, a lanky kid with a mean-looking face, headed for the barn. The other, stockier and older, started walking a grid pattern through the western pasture, straight toward Gideon's hiding place. 10 minutes. That's how long he had before they found him. Gideon pressed himself flat against the warm stone, his mind racing. He couldn't outrun them in the open. His rifle was a world away in the cabin. All he had was the skinning knife on his belt. A good blade for gutting a deer, but useless against 3 armed men. Suddenly, Boone's voice cut through the air again, this time directed down into the hole. Listen up down there. We've got a complication. Someone found this place. Means we're moving you. Tonight. A wave of panic was audible from below. Mercy's voice trembled for the first time. Move us where? Somewhere permanent, Boone said, and the finality in his tone chilled Gideon to the bone. The folks back east are dragging their feet on the pavement, and now we have a security problem. A man's angry voice shouted up from the darkness. You promised. You said if our families paid, you'd let us go. That was before some fool started digging holes where he shouldn't, Boone shot back. Pack your things. We ride at sunset. And Gideon understood. Moving them didn't mean a new prison. It meant a shallow grave. His discovery had forced their hand. The only way to erase the evidence now was to eliminate the witnesses. All of them. The stocky man was getting closer. 50 yards now. He was turning over rocks, kicking at bushes. In 5 minutes, he'd be standing right over him. Gideon pulled the skinning knife from its sheath. The polished steel gleamed in the sun. 3 to 1 were impossible odds. But maybe, just maybe, he could change the odds. His eyes darted to the barn. The lanky man had disappeared inside. If Gideon could get there, get to him before the other one reached the boulders. It was a crazy risk, but it was the only one he had. He waited until the searcher in the pasture turned his back. Then he exploded from behind the rock, running low and fast, his boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He was a ghost, a shadow moving across his own land. The barn's back door was ajar, hanging from a single rusted hinge. He could hear the man inside talking softly to Gideon's 2 horses. Easy now, boys, just seeing if your owner's tucked in with you. Gideon flattened himself against the weathered planks, his knife held tight in a white-knuckled grip. The man inside was just a kid, really, no older than 20. He had the kind of face that hadn't seen enough of the world to know true evil. The kid stepped out of a stall, his back to the door, peering into the feed bins. That was his last mistake. Gideon moved like lightning. One hand clamped over the kid's mouth, stifling his scream. The other drove the knife home, a single, precise motion between the ribs. The kid went limp in his arms, his life extinguished in a silent, brutal instant. Gideon gently lowered the body behind a stack of hay bales, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He took the revolver from the dead man's holster, a Colt, heavy and real. Now it was 2 against 1. The odds were still terrible, but they weren't impossible anymore. Through a grimy window in the barn, Gideon watched the other 2. Boone was still at the hole, poking at the dirt with a stick, his focus absolute. The stocky searcher, the one he'd evaded, was now calling out for his partner. Hey, Charlie, you find anything in there? Silence. Charlie would never answer again, but his silence was a ticking clock. Boone wasn't a fool. He'd notice soon. He'd know something was wrong. From the hole, Gideon heard the faint sound of a child crying. The sound was muffled, quickly shushed. A child. They had a child down there. A cold black rage, hotter than any fear, flooded Gideon's veins. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in 5 years, not since the fever took his own wife and son while he was away on a cattle drive. He had come home to a silent house and 2 fresh graves. He had failed them. He wouldn't fail these people. Charlie! The stocky man's voice was sharper now, laced with concern. Where in the hell are you? Boone looked up from the hole, his head cocked. What is it? Charlie's not answering. He went in the barn 10 minutes ago. It was happening. The discovery was seconds away. Once they found Charlie's body, the element of surprise would be gone. He'd be facing 2 experienced killers who knew he was there, knew he was armed, and knew he was hunting them. Boone drew his own pistol, his eyes locked on the barn. He started walking toward it slowly, while the remaining man, Tommy, approached from the other side. They were flanking the building, their movements practiced and deadly. If someone got Charlie, they're still in there, Boone called out. Stay sharp, Tommy. This ain't no simple rancher. Gideon's eyes darted around the barn. Running was suicide. They'd cut him down before he made it 10 feet. But there was a ladder, a wooden ladder leading up to the hayloft. If he could get up there, get above them. He scrambled up the ladder, the old wood groaning under his weight. Each creak sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. He laid flat on the floor of the loft, peering through the gaps in the floorboards. He could see the whole barn below him. Charlie's body was hidden, but not well. A thorough search would find him. Tommy reached the barn entrance, his pistol raised. He paused, listening. Charlie? You in there, pal? He took a cautious step inside, his eyes sweeping the shadowy corners. Another step, then one more. He was almost directly beneath Gideon. Gideon raised the stolen Colt, the barrel steady in his hand. This was it. But before he could pull the trigger, Boone's voice rang out from outside, sharp and triumphant. Found him! Gideon's blood turned to ice. He shifted, looking through a crack in the barn wall. Boone was crouched on the ground, pointing at a small dark patch in the dirt just outside the back door. A bloodstain. Charlie's blood. It was a tiny detail, one that most men would have missed. But Boone Carter wasn't most men. Tommy, get out of there! Now! Boone yelled. He dragged the body inside. He's in the barn. Tommy scrambled backward out of the entrance, his face pale. Gideon was trapped, cornered. He heard Boone say the words that sealed his fate. What's the plan, Boone? Tommy asked, his voice shaking slightly. Boone's reply was simple and terrible. Burn it. Burn it to the ground. Let's see if he comes out to play. Smoke. The acrid smell of burning hay began to fill the loft. Boone was wasting no time. He'd gathered dry grass, twigs, anything that would catch, and piled it against the barn's outer wall. Tommy stood by with a lit match. The fire would take hold in minutes. The entire structure would be an inferno. They were flushing him out, giving him a simple choice: burn to death or come out and be shot. And worse, the prisoners below would see the smoke. They would smell it. They would know their only hope was being roasted alive, and their own execution was next. Gideon's mind worked faster than it ever had before. He couldn't stay, he couldn't hide. But maybe he didn't have to run from them. Maybe he could run at them. He looked down through the floorboards. The main entrance was blocked by fire and 2 gunmen. But the hayloft had a large loading door at the front, directly above the entrance. It was a 20-foot drop, but it was a chance. Just as Tommy tossed the match and the kindling roared to life, Gideon made his move. He didn't climb down. He didn't hesitate. He took a running start and plunged through the hayloft opening, landing in a jarring heap on the ground below, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The sound of his landing, the surprise of it, gave him a precious second. The first shot from Boone's pistol splintered the wood of the barn door right where his head had been. The second from Tommy kicked up a spray of dirt at his heels as he scrambled to his feet and sprinted away from the now burning barn. He's running for the rocks, Tommy yelled, already giving chase. Cut him off at the creek bed. But Gideon wasn't running for the rocks, not really. He dove behind a low stone wall that bordered his pasture, just as they expected. But then he did something they didn't expect. He didn't stay there. He doubled back, crawling on his belly, using the wall as cover, moving parallel to the barn. The maneuver was risky, insane even, but it put him on their flank. It put him 30 yards from the hole where the prisoners were kept, with a clear view of both men. Tommy had taken the bait, running hard for the creek to head off Gideon's imagined escape, and that left Boone Carter standing alone, shoving fresh cartridges into his pistol, his eyes glued to the stone wall, where he thought his target was pinned down. This was his only shot. Gideon rested the barrel of Charlie's revolver on top of the wall, took a deep breath, let it out slow, and squeezed the trigger. The Colt bucked in his hand. Boone cried out, a sharp curse of pain and surprise, and spun sideways, clutching his right shoulder. His pistol flew from his grasp, landing in the dirt several feet away. It wasn't a kill shot. He hadn't been aiming to kill. He'd been aiming to disarm, to even the odds. Gideon vaulted the wall and charged, covering the ground between them in seconds. The wounded outlaw was on his knees, crawling desperately for his fallen gun. Gideon's boot kicked it away, sending it skittering across the hard earth. "Tommy!" Boone roared, his voice a mix of pain and fury. "Get back here, now!" Tommy appeared from behind a rock outcropping 50 yards away, his gun up. But he froze. He had a clear shot at Gideon, but Boone was in the way. He couldn't risk hitting his boss. It was a standoff. "Tell your man to drop it," Gideon said, pressing the barrel of the Colt against the back of Boone's head. "Or this ends right now." Boone let out a harsh, pained laugh. "You think this is over, rancher? You think killing me changes anything? We have partners, people who will come looking when we don't check in. All you've done is paint a target on your own back." "Maybe," Gideon grunted, shoving the gun harder against his skull. "But you won't be here to see it." From the dark hole behind them, Mercy's voice rose, filled with a new, terrifying urgency. "Please, whatever you're doing, you have to hurry. There's a child down here, a little girl. She's sick, burning with fever. She needs a doctor." A sick child. The words cut through the tension, changing the stakes completely. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about saving a life. Right now. Gideon made his decision. "Tommy!" he shouted, his voice ringing across the field. "Your boss is bleeding out. Drop your gun and ride. Or you can stand there and watch him die while you think about it." The young outlaw hesitated, his eyes flicking between his wounded leader and the endless prairie that represented escape. He was just a kid, caught up in something bigger and deadlier than he'd ever imagined. Loyalty versus survival. Gideon could see the war in his eyes. Slowly, agonizingly, Tommy lowered his pistol. "Boone's been good to me," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but I ain't dying for him." "Smart man," Gideon said. "Put the gun on the ground, then get on your horse and don't ever look back." Tommy did as he was told, his movements stiff and jerky. He placed the gun down, backed away, and scrambled onto his horse. Within a minute, he was just a cloud of dust on the eastern horizon. Boone stared after him, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. "The coward," he spat, blood bubbling on his lips. "You think you've won?" Gideon ignored him, pulling a coil of rope from his saddle and expertly hog-tying the wounded man, pulling the knots tight. Boone cursed and threatened, promising a world of pain from his connections, but Gideon just cinched the rope tighter. The outlaw was losing blood, but the wound wasn't fatal. He would live to see the inside of a cell. With Boone secured, Gideon turned to the hole. He descended the stairs, the stale, foul air of the prison washing over him. The space below was a natural limestone cave, larger than he'd imagined, but it was a place of utter despair. 6 people were chained to iron rings set in the rock wall. They stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. Mercy Whitmore was there, her face smudged with dirt, but her gaze strong. And beside her, on a pile of filthy blankets, was a little girl, no older than 8. She was pale, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her mother wept silently beside her. "The fever came on 3 days ago," Mercy explained as Gideon used the keys from Boone's belt to unlock their shackles. "She won't wake up." The others, 2 older merchants, a teenage boy who looked hauntingly like Gideon's own son, were weak but on their feet. One by one, he helped them up the stairs and into the blinding sunlight. He carried the little girl himself, her body feeling as light and fragile as a bird's. "There's a doctor in Bleakwood," he told them, his voice thick with emotion. "We can make it if we leave now." He loaded the unconscious Boone into the back of his wagon like a sack of grain. The rescued prisoners climbed in, huddling together, their eyes still wide with the shock of freedom. Mercy held the sick child, wrapping her in a clean blanket from Gideon's cabin. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood, the wagon rolled out, heading south toward Bleakwood. Gideon pushed the horses hard, every minute precious. He knew there would be questions. A dead man in his burned-down barn. A secret prison on his land. His quiet, solitary life was over. But as he listened to the quiet murmurs of the people behind him, the sound of hope returning to their voices, he felt something he hadn't felt in 5 long years. Purpose. He hadn't been able to save his own family from the randomness of fate, but today he had saved 6 strangers from the deliberate evil of men. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. But here's the thing about stories like this. They never end where you think they do. As they traveled through the growing dusk, Gideon noticed something in the dirt of the wagon bed, kicked loose from Boone's pocket during the rough ride. It wasn't a coin or a bullet. It was a small folded piece of paper. He reached back and picked it up. Unfolding it, he saw a list of names and numbers, payments, and the last name on the list, next to the largest sum of money, made his blood run colder than the night air. It was a name he knew all too well. Sheriff Morrison. The name on that piece of paper changed everything. Sheriff Morrison, the law in Bleakwood, the man he was riding to for help. He wasn't just a slow, complacent sheriff. He was a partner, part of the whole rotten operation. Gideon's plan to ride into town and hand over his prisoner went up in smoke. Walking into Morrison's office would be walking into a trap. He'd be silenced, Boone would be set free, and the whole dark secret would be buried for good, along with Gideon and the 6 people in his wagon. He felt a new wave of cold dread wash over him. He was still in the middle of the fight, not at the end of it. The enemy wasn't just a wounded man tied up in his wagon. It was the very system he was supposed to trust. He looked back at the small group huddled together, at the pale face of the sick little girl. He couldn't turn back. He couldn't go forward. They were trapped, alone in the vast, dark prairie, with enemies on all sides. "What is it?" Mercy asked, her voice soft. She had seen the look on his face. He hesitated, then passed her the crumpled paper. Her eyes scanned the list, and he saw the same dawning horror in her expression. She understood immediately. They were driving straight into the lion's den. "What do we do?" she whispered, her hand instinctively tightening on the blanket around the sick child. Gideon didn't have an answer. His mind was a frantic blank. For every option he considered, a dozen new dangers appeared. If they turned off the main trail, Morrison would know something was wrong. He was likely expecting Boone to check in. When he didn't, the sheriff would come looking, and he wouldn't come alone. They had maybe a few hours of a head start, at best. The child moaned softly in her sleep, her breathing becoming more ragged. The doctor was in Bleakwood. Their only hope for her was in the one town they couldn't enter. It was an impossible choice. Let the child die out here in the wilderness, or risk walking into a trap that would kill them all. From the back of the wagon, a low chuckle made them both jump. It was Boone. His eyes were open, gleaming with a feverish light in the moonlight. He'd been playing possum, listening to every word. "See, rancher?" he rasped, a bloody grin splitting his face. "You can't win. You're smart. I'll give you that. Smarter than Charlie and Tommy. But you're just one man. We're everywhere. The law, the freight office, the telegraph operator. This whole territory is ours. You should have just kept digging your well." Every word was a hammer blow, confirming Gideon's worst fears. This wasn't just a kidnapping ring. It was a shadow government, a cancer that had infected the whole region. How could one man fight that? He felt the cold grip of despair tighten around his heart. For a moment, he thought about what Tommy had done. just riding away, forgetting everything. It was tempting. But then he looked at the child. He looked at Mercy's determined, terrified face, and he remembered the promise he'd made to himself over the graves of his wife and son. Never again. Never again would he fail to protect those who needed him. "There's another town," he said, his voice low but steady. "Rock Creek. It's 60 miles west, twice as far. There's a doctor there, an old army surgeon. We go there." It was a desperate gamble. The journey would be brutal. The child might not make it, and Morrison's men would be hunting them the entire way. But it was a chance. It was the only chance they had. Mercy nodded, her eyes locking with his. "We trust you, Gideon." He cracked the reins, turning the horses off the main trail and into the untamed wilderness, the wagon wheels bumping and jarring over the rough ground. They were officially fugitives, running from the law, hunted by a powerful and unseen enemy. And as they disappeared into the darkness, Gideon knew this was no longer just about rescuing 6 people. This was about tearing out the entire rotten heart of Boone Carter's operation, even if it cost him his own life. The battle for the barren field was over, but the war had just begun. The journey to Rock Creek was a special kind of hell. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. They traveled without a fire, eating cold rations from Gideon's cabin, their only light the pale, unforgiving moon. The little girl, whose name they learned was Sarah, was getting worse. Her fever was a raging fire, and she drifted in and out of a restless, mumbling delirium. Her mother prayed constantly, her quiet sobs a heartbreaking rhythm in the dark. Boone Carter, tied securely in the back, became their tormentor. He was weak from his wound, but his mind was sharp and cruel. He mocked their efforts, described in graphic detail what Sheriff Morrison's men would do to them when they were caught. He told them about other families who had been captured, other ransoms that had gone wrong. He was trying to break them, to fill them with the same hopelessness that fueled his own dark world. Gideon ignored him, his focus narrowed to a single point: survival. He pushed the horses and himself to the brink of exhaustion, navigating by the stars, his knowledge of the harsh landscape their only map. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a protector, a guide, a hunted man with the lives of 7 others resting squarely on his shoulders. On the second night, they saw it, a flicker of light on the horizon behind them, a campfire, then another further to the north. Morrison's men. They were fanning out, casting a wide net. They knew Gideon couldn't have just vanished. They were hunting him systematically. The fear in the wagon was a thick, tangible thing. One of the old merchants began to weep, convinced they were doomed. But Mercy was a rock. She tended to Sarah. She rationed their dwindling water supply, and she spoke to the others in a calm, steady voice that belied the terror they all felt. She and Gideon became a silent team, communicating with glances and nods, a bond forged in shared desperation. Late on the 3rd day, as they were crossing a shallow rocky river, disaster struck. The front axle of the wagon, strained by the rough terrain, cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The wagon lurched violently, tipping to one side, sending them all tumbling. Gideon managed to control the panicked horses, but the damage was done. The wagon was crippled. They were stranded, miles from any town, with their supplies scattered and a posse closing in. "It's over," Boone snarled from where he lay in the dirt, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "They'll find you by morning. Game over, rancher." For a single crushing moment, Gideon believed him. The broken wagon was a symbol of their broken hope. He had failed, but then he looked at Sarah, lying pale and still in her mother's arms. Her breathing was so shallow now it was barely there. He couldn't give up, not while she was still breathing. "We're not taking the wagon," he announced, his voice ringing with a conviction he didn't feel. "We're taking the horses. We travel lighter, faster. We can still make it." They abandoned everything but the water, a little food, and the blankets. Gideon put Sarah and her mother on one horse. He and Mercy would ride the other, with the remaining prisoners walking alongside, taking turns riding when they could. But that left a problem. What to do with Boone? They couldn't take him. He would slow them down. But they couldn't leave him behind either. If Morrison's men found him, he would tell them exactly which way his captors had gone. Leaving him was a death sentence for them all. Killing him was an option that crossed Gideon's mind, a dark and tempting thought. It would be easy, justified, but as he looked at the wounded, helpless man, he knew he couldn't do it. That's what separated him from men like Boone and Morrison. Mercy saw the struggle in his eyes. She walked over and stood beside him, looking down at their prisoner. "There's another way," she said softly. He looked at her, confused. Her plan was simple and brutal. They wouldn't leave him for the posse to find. They would leave him for the wilderness. They tied him to a tree just out of sight of the broken wagon, but close enough that he could hear anyone who approached. They left him with a canteen of water, just enough to prolong his suffering. It was a cruel fate, but it was their only chance. "You can't just leave me here!" Boone screamed as they prepared to depart, his bravado finally cracking. "The wolves! The coyotes!" Gideon looked him dead in the eye. "You should have thought of that before you built a prison for children." He turned and mounted his horse, not looking back. As they rode away, Boone's curses and pleas faded into the distance, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. They had bought themselves a little more time, but they were on foot and on horseback now, exposed and vulnerable, with a dying child and a long, desperate road ahead. And they both knew that Sheriff Morrison's net was closing in. The next 48 hours were a blur of exhaustion and fear. They moved as fast as they could, the able-bodied men running alongside the horses to spare their strength. Every distant coyote howl was the sound of an approaching posse. Every circling vulture was an omen of their own demise. Sarah's condition was dire. The fever had broken, but it had left her frighteningly weak, her small body racked with shivers despite the heat. She needed medicine. She needed a doctor. She was running out of time. Gideon pushed them relentlessly, his face a grim mask of determination. He was running on pure adrenaline and the memory of his own lost family. He navigated them through treacherous canyons and across sun-baked plains, his instincts the only thing keeping them alive. He was a man possessed. Late in the afternoon on the fifth day, they saw it from the top of a ridge. Not a town, but a single isolated homestead. A thread of smoke rose from a stone chimney. It was a risk, a terrible risk. The homestead could belong to anyone, a friend of Morrison's, another member of the conspiracy. But they were out of water, and Sarah was fading fast. They had no choice. Leaving the others hidden in the rocks, Gideon approached the homestead alone, the stolen colt in his hand, but held down at his side. An old woman was sitting on the porch, rocking slowly in a chair, a shotgun laid across her lap. She watched him approach, her eyes as sharp and clear as a hawk's. "That's far enough, mister," she called out, her voice raspy with age but firm as granite. "State your business." Gideon stopped, raising his hand slowly to show he meant no harm. He told her his story, a shortened version of it at least. He told her about the sick child, about running from men who wore badges but served no law. He didn't know if she would believe him. He just prayed she would. The old woman listened, without expression, her gaze never leaving his face. When he was done, she was silent for a long time. Then she spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "The law in these parts is as crooked as a dog's hind leg," she said. "I've heard whispers about Boone Carter, and I know Sheriff Morrison is a snake. Bring the child." Hope, so fierce it was painful, surged through Gideon. The old woman, whose name was Elspeth, was a widow and a healer. She knew herbs and remedies passed down through generations. She took one look at Sarah and clicked her tongue. "This ain't no ordinary fever," she muttered, her hands gentle as they examined the child. "This is poison, slow acting, meant to make sure there are no witnesses left to talk." Poison! The word hung in the air, more chilling than any of Boone's threats. They hadn't just been held for ransom, they had been marked for death from the very beginning. Elspeth worked quickly, brewing a foul-smelling tea from herbs she kept in dried bunches hanging from her rafters. She forced the dark liquid down Sarah's throat, a few drops at a time. For hours the child's life hung in the balance. Gideon and the others could only watch, helpless, as the old woman fought a war against the poison. As dusk fell, Elspeth came out to the porch where Gideon was keeping watch. "She'll live," she said simply. The poison will take days to leave her system, but the worst is over. Gideon felt his knees go weak with relief. He had done it. He had gotten her to safety. But their ordeal was far from over. Morrison's men rode by here this morning, Elspeth added, reloading her shotgun. Asked if I'd seen a man with a group of people. I told them I hadn't seen anyone in weeks. They didn't believe me. They said they'd be back. They had to leave, now, but they were in no condition to travel. Just then, one of the rescued merchants, a man named Silas, came running from the ridge where he'd been standing lookout. His face was ashen. "Riders!" he gasped. "A dozen of them! Coming fast!" There was no time to run, no place to hide. They were caught. Gideon grabbed the Colt, his mind racing. He had one gun, 6 bullets, against a dozen men. It was a suicide stand. But as the riders drew closer, he saw something that made him pause. They weren't riding like a posse, and the man in the lead, he wasn't Sheriff Morrison. He was a U.S. Marshal. And beside him, riding tall and proud, was the young outlaw Tommy. He hadn't run to get reinforcements for Boone. He had ridden day and night to the nearest federal marshal's office 200 miles away and told them everything. He had chosen survival, but he had also chosen redemption. The posse surrounded the homestead, their rifles ready. The marshal dismounted, his eyes hard. "You Gideon Flint?" he asked. Gideon nodded slowly. "I'm Marshal John Bridges. We got a report about a kidnapping ring run by Boone Carter and facilitated by Sheriff Morrison of Bleakwood." The relief was so overwhelming, Gideon almost collapsed. It was over. The law, the real law, was here. They took his statement. They listened to the stories of Mercy and the other prisoners. Tommy, despite his crimes, would receive a lighter sentence for his cooperation. As for Sheriff Morrison and the rest of the network, their time was coming. The marshal and his men would ride to Bleakwood and clean the town out from top to bottom. As the sun rose the next morning, casting a golden light over the land, Gideon looked at the group of people he had saved. They were survivors. They would carry the scars of their ordeal forever, but they were alive and they were free. Mercy walked over and stood beside him, Sarah holding her hand, looking up at Gideon with wide, curious eyes. "You saved us," Mercy said, her voice thick with an emotion that went beyond gratitude. "You saved all of us." Gideon looked out at the vast prairie, the same land that had felt so empty and lonely just a week ago. He had lost his family on this land, but he had found a new one, a new purpose. He hadn't just been digging a well, he had been digging his way out of his own dark hole of grief. He had faced down evil, fought against impossible odds, and brought a forgotten group of people back into the light. The fight wasn't over. The world was still a dangerous place, but for the first time in a very long time, Gideon Flint felt like he had a reason to face the dawn. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice against all odds, then you're not going to want to miss the video on your screen right now. It's another incredible tale where an ordinary person is pushed to do extraordinary things. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Your support helps us keep finding and sharing these amazing accounts of courage. Let us know in the comments below. What would you have done if you were in Gideon's boots?